The budget battles begin. Governor Hochul facing off against a more progressive legislature, ditto Mayor Adams. The Point starts right now. First up, as we consider our fiscal health, is State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli. Welcome, but also we have a big problem. We have a big budget, $233 billion. The governor said we can't spend like there's no tomorrow because tomorrow actually arrives.
It's here, yeah.
So here's the question. In any budget she proposes, the legislature disposes. And the legislature is going to want to spend more money. Yeah. Is there more money to spend?
Well, there always is. The question is how much and where will you get it from? The challenge really right now, Marcia, is looking at the out-year budget picture.
Big gaps.
Yeah, I mean, in the short run, you know, having served in the legislature, there's always a way to balance the budget for the coming year. But what we don't do a good job of in New York is looking at the implications of choices we make on spending in the current year. What does it mean a year, 2, 4 years out? That's where I'm hoping decisions will be made that'll start to control some of the gaps that we have in the out years. So that means being more careful on spending, and this budget does increase spending, but at a much more modest rate than we've done it in recent years. Part of that's because the federal money is being spent down, and I hope we don't resort to much more borrowing, because that's one of the big issues we don't talk about enough in New York. We're one of the most highly indebted states in the nation. So in the effort to spend more money, if you're debating on taxes, sometimes the easy way out in the short run is to borrow more money. That, though, creates a big expense on debt service that then takes away the opportunity to spend money on programs.
The legislature is going to look at the fact that tax receipts actually came in more than we were expecting.
Yep.
I mean, originally they were projecting a gap of about $9 billion for this fiscal year. It was reduced almost half, more than half, to $4.3 billion.
Right.
So now they're going to say
more came in. But you know, you're making an important point, because all this is based on projections, and the projections do change and get updated, because if we were talking, you know, 6 months ago, we would be saying tax receipts are coming in lower than projections. But the biggest revenue source for the state is the personal income tax.
Right.
And you look at how much money we're receiving now. We're behind what we were getting a year ago. So the overall picture is still one of more negative.
So that raises an interesting question, because the governor in her speech talked about her concern about raising taxes, because she said that it leads to something that we call out-migration.
Taxpayer migration.
People leaving the state to go to pick a place. Florida, New Jersey. New Jersey is actually the #1 place they go to, but that's another one. But what that does, she said, it created a loss of about $6 billion. $6 billion in tax receipts. So, you know, there's like this, I guess, this fine balance that you have to strike between not raising taxes and the legislature, your friends in the legislature who want to tax the rich. Where do you come down on that?
Well, you know, I've always said we need to be mindful of this impact of taxpayer migration, and we've issued some reports on this to really document the fact that we are losing people at the upper income level, and you know, the top 1% of taxpayers carry over 40% of the personal income tax revenue that supports all the other programs. But we're also losing people at the other end, at the more moderate and lower income end. Can't afford to live in New York anymore. So demographically, we're having huge changes because of the affordability issue and the tax issue. It certainly impacts on the strength of our economy moving forward. So I would say, do not rush to raise. Look, we already have a surcharge on higher income New Yorkers. We already have a progressive income tax structure. You know, the frustration I always have as controller is what happens is, if folks don't raise taxes and they want to spend more money on programs, back to what I said before, they borrow more money, and that's becoming an issue that we don't focus on enough. I think the big flashpoint is going to be, and you've covered this for many years, Marcia, once again, is going to be education spending. That is always the last piece.
They always want to add more money for education.
And you know, her proposal has an increase of a little over $800 million. It's a more modest increase than we've seen in recent budgets. You saw that the very traditional whole harmless, which meant that no district would get anything less than the year before, taking that away. So I think those are going to be some of the flashpoints already, and I think that's going to be potentially the item that'll make it difficult to close the budget. What will be the spending on schools? The other big cost area, healthcare, Medicaid. The Medicaid rolls are higher than projected. We had warned about that. It's a big expense area, growing way beyond inflation.
What do you do about it?
We really have to look at the level of services. Look, we do audits all the time in the Medicaid program.
Do you cut the services that people on Medicaid can get?
That becomes very tricky.
That's like a third rail.
And because the hospitals depend on it, and long-term care, a lot of folks end up on Medicaid, you know, at the end of life. But we are not efficient in how we're spending those Medicaid dollars.
How can we do it better?
Well, I always say start by reading the audits we put out that has identified hundreds of millions of dollars where you could save money if you're smarter about how you're spending it, eliminate some of the duplication. You actually won't compromise or hurt the services. But because that program is so massive.
Fraud? Is any of it fraud?
Fraud is a part of it, but I think it's more inefficiency than it is fraud. So again, look, we have Medicaid Inspector General, the Attorney General's office does work here, my office does work here, but the costs are way beyond what we can manage.
So let's talk about another thing. It has to do with the money that the governor has given to the mayor for migrants.
Yeah.
$2.4 billion.
Yeah.
But the thing that she did that a lot of people are questioning is the fact that she decided to tap $500 million from the rainy day fund to pay for migrants. How do you feel about that? Good idea, bad idea, something to worry about?
I'm concerned because, you know, we've been very critical for a number of years with the fact that New York has been very poorly positioned as far as our reserves. To the governor's credit and the legislature's credit, they have addressed that in the past two budgets. So up to about $19.5 billion in reserves. Most of that is in the informal reserves, which makes it easy to dip into.
Why do you need reserves that big?
Oh, because of COVID coming out of nowhere, the Great Recession, you know, over a decade ago, we weren't prepared to deal with either of those dynamics. So the concern is if you're starting to dip into that, and you could argue the migrant cost is an unexpected emergency. What I would like to see, though, is some commitment to put that money back in the reserve. What we don't have now are clear guidelines on when you would use those reserves, because most of those reserves are actually what we call informal reserves. A very small portion of it is in what I would prefer, which are statutory restricted reserves, which you can only dip into under very special circumstances. So I don't necessarily object to using some of that money right now, but what's the commitment to pay that $500 million back so we replenish the money that's taken out?
So who do you have to get the commitment from? The mayor or the governor or the legislature?
It'd be the governor or the legislature, yeah.
Both of them have to commit to it?
Well, they should. I mean, you know, the governor could certainly, because again, much of this is informal reserves, the governor through their own budget, you know, actions could restore that back. I would prefer to see it in statutory language that the money is going to be paid back. Because the concern, by the way, is with your other questions, will some of them want to dip into even more than that to pay some of the programs? And that's not, the reserve should not be used for that purpose, not for ongoing expected programs. That's not what the reserves are for. They're really for an emergency.
But as you know, you're a former assemblyman.
Yeah.
You know that there's a tendency to want to fund the things that the legislatures like, either the House, the Senate,
especially in election year. It's an election year too.
Right, and they're all running for election in November.
Yeah.
So how do you stop them from trying to spend more and saying, well, if she's going to tap $500 million for her issue, what about taking a few shekels more for our issues?
Good question, and no simple answer to it other than the fact that hopefully folks like the state controller will warn folks, you got to be careful. That's not responsible budgeting. I have a feeling you're going to be issuing a lot of warnings between now and April 1st. We always do, and you know, we don't have the force of law, but we try to be. I always say I don't have a vote or a veto, but we do have a voice, and we're going to continue to call for responsible budgeting and sound fiscal management. You think it's in the realm of reality that they'll return the money? Yes, I really do. Because it's like anything else, you can make a commitment, and for some reason you have other issues, you know, there are ways to, unfortunately, sometimes evade those commitments. But at least the intention should be there very clearly that that reserve is meant for emergencies. It's not meant to be a slush fund to help you with short-term budget issues. But the migrants was an emergency and is an emergency. It certainly was not anticipated. It wasn't budgeted for. And you know, the concern, Marcia, is obviously is it's going to be an ongoing situation. It's not going to end tomorrow. So you're not going to be able to tap that emergency fund next year or the year? Well, arguably you can, but let's hope that by then, you know, hopefully the federal government will step up and play a bigger role. It's something the mayor and the governor have been appropriately calling for. Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it right there for now. But our conversation continues right after the show on our streaming channel, CBS News New York.